I think I've given enough specific examples. Now on to some more general considerations. The ancient world suffered from a plague we haven't quite yet outgrown. I'm talking about the S word. That's right, syncretism. There was so much cross-fertilization of different traditions of various religions that your head would spin to try to untangle it all. What is remarkable when we come to the Bible, however, is how particularistic as opposed to syncretistic that it is. While there have been various professing Christians and professing Jews over the years who have been syncretists, the Bible itself condemns it in no uncertain terms. As a matter of fact, in the Old Testament, the death penalty was enforced against those who follow other gods. In New Testament times, then, the apostolic Christians were surrounded by a melting pot of various religious traditions which were melded together. The early Christians were very careful to distance themselves from these other traditions. For example, the Gnostic Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, were not allowed into the canon because they were Gnostic or syncretistic or not with the unique Christian tradition, but all these pagan things melded together. So these Christians would immediately recognize these religious traditions they were surrounded by. Also, before becoming Christians, the apostolic church believed, before becoming Christians, they believed these pagan myths themselves. So they could clearly distinguish between pagan myth and Christian kerygma. It was the uniqueness of the kerygma, I would guess, that so attracted them to it, at least in part. That was the attraction, I'm guessing. The gospel was not the same old thing. What you have to realize is that at times the Bible is directed against the views and practices of pagan culture. This has led many people to suppose Moses, or whomever, was copying his protology from Mesopotamia. There is enough similarity so the Mesopotamians would get the point, but again, the differences are so incredible and so remarkable that makes the differences more significant than the similarities. You are kind of almost right when you say X, Moses wrote, but wrong when you say Y, Z, and so on. And then the apostles died for their belief that they personally saw Jesus rise bodily from the dead as an objective fact in space and time. Why would they die if they knew Jesus never really existed and they made the whole thing up or plagiarized a story about Mithras, changing the name Mithras to Jesus? These kinds of myth stealer claims are not at all plausible once you scratch below the surface. The bottom line of everything I've said so far in this series is that the story of Jesus was not stolen from prior or contemporary at that time, pagan mythology. This is manifestly so. The facts are clear and their implications are undeniable. So the story of Jesus was not stolen from pagan mythology. I shall close with a rather lengthy quote from C.S. Lewis. The quotation is taken from his book Miracles, the chapter on the resurrection of Christ, and that chapter is entitled The Grand Miracle. So in my edition of the book, this comes from pages 181 to 187. Lewis writes, "The doctrine of the Incarnation, if accepted, puts this principle even more emphatically at the center. The pattern is there in nature because it was first there in God. All the instances of which I have mentioned turn out to be but transpositions of the divine theme into a minor key. I am not now referring simply to the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. The total pattern, of which they are only the turning point, is the real death and rebirth. For certainly no seed ever fell from so fair a tree into so dark and cold a soil as would furnish more than a faint analogy to this huge descent and reascension in which God dredged the salt and oozy bottom of creation. From this point of view, the Christian doctrine makes itself so quickly at home amid the deepest apprehensions of reality which we have from other sources, that doubt may spring up in a new direction. That doubt may spring up in a new direction. Is it not fitting in too well? So well that it must have come into men's minds from seeing this pattern elsewhere, particularly in the annual death and resurrection of the corn? For there have, of course, been many religions in which that annual drama, so important for the life of the tribe, was almost admittedly the central theme, and the deity, Adonis, Osiris, or another, almost undisguisedly a personification of the corn, a corn king who dies and rose again each year. Is not Christ simply another corn king? Now this brings us to the oddest thing about Christianity. In a sense, the view which I have just described is actually true. From a certain point of view, Christ is the same sort of thing as Adonis or Osiris, always, of course, waiving the fact that they lived. Nobody knows. Always, of course, waiving the fact that Adonis and Osiris lived, nobody knows where or when, while he, Jesus, was executed by a Roman magistrate, we know, in a year which can be roughly dated. And that is just the puzzle. If Christianity is a religion of that kind, why is the analogy of the seed falling into the ground so seldom mentioned? Twice only, if I mistake not, in the New Testament. Corn religions are popular and respectable. If that is what the first Christian teachers were putting across, what motive could they have for concealing the fact? The impression they make is that of men who simply don't know how close they are to the corn religions. Men who simply overlook the rich sources of relevant imagery and association which they must have been on the verge of tapping at every moment. If you say they suppressed it because they were Jews, that only raises the puzzle in a new form. Why should the only religion of a dying God, which has actually survived and risen to unexampled spiritual heights, occur precisely among those people to whom, and to whom almost alone, the whole circle of ideas that belong to the dying God is foreign? I myself, who first seriously read the New Testament when I was, imaginatively and poetically, all agog for the death and rebirth pattern, and anxious to meet a corn king, was chilled and puzzled by the almost total absence of such ideas in the Christian documents. One moment particularly stood out. A dying God, the only God who might possibly be historical, holds bread, that is corn, in his hand and says, "This is my body." Surely here, even if nowhere else, or surely if not here, at least in the earliest comments on this passage, and through all later devotional usage in ever-swelling volume, the truth must come out. The connection between this and the annual drama of the crops must be made, but it is not. It is there for me, there is no sign. It was there for the disciples, or, humanly speaking, for Christ himself. It is almost as if he did not realize what he had said. And we'll continue in the next video.